Hey guys, so we just had our first weekend worth of regional events post-balance. So of course, Ryzeal and Maliss are the new meta contenders, and as usual, I wanted to do a tier list of the best meta and rogue decks using not just regional level data, but also Dueling Book data as well. Of course, it's only the first weekend of events, so unfortunately the score is going to be a little volatile, and also we did not have any YCS level events, and we won't have it for a couple of months, but I tried my best. And as always, definitely go check out my discount codes Hakuna5 or Hakuna10 on Yu-Gi-Oh! Sleeves, supplies, as well as singles. All of that in the description below. And also, as always, definitely a big shout out to YGOProduct.com as well as Ivan for keeping up with all of the meta relevant tops all the time. Anyways, let's just get to the meta tier list for this month, and no surprise, it is Ryzeal, and they're actually dominating 40% of the top cut of regional level events first weekend, and there were a lot of regional level events this past weekend, so the deck is definitely, for sure, very strong. I did actually recently survey Ryzeal players to go over the key strengths and weaknesses of the deck. One of the weaknesses they did point out was the fact that because the engine is so compact, they can tend to brick on a lot of the hand traps, which is why you're seeing the Fiendsmith version being pretty popular as well. That sort of helps mitigate that issue, at least until the Tachyon cards come out in a few months, right? So I think the end board, honestly, is actually pretty fair for the most part. I mean, obviously, something like Abyss Dweller is not really fair. Who knows if that ever gets hit. I mean, it definitely comes in and out of formats. They also have access to Baguska. The Detonator, that one is definitely strong. Just the multiple pops with the protection effect, where it can also protect other Xyz monsters like Baguska and Dweller as well. And the field spell, of course, really tricky to deal with as well. But overall, I mean, we've seen way stronger decks, I would say. So next we have Maliss. I think going into this format, most people probably assumed that this deck was going to be the second best one after Ryzeal, at least for now. And it is definitely still very strong and worth respect. The Sky Striker version of this deck has actually been picking up some popularity as well, and actually did pick up a few tops as well this past weekend at regional level. But for the most part, right now at least, it is pure. Who knows how that transitions? And definitely really strong deck, can banish a lot of things. It can actually OTK quite easily too, just because they just keep coming back when they're banished, and also get their attacks doubled. Even access code, you could banish like their Maliss monster to pop a card, and then the Maliss monster just comes back. So from my experience, it's been essentially OTKing really easily. So I think it's a pretty unique playstyle too, the fact that you can sort of like set your traps, and sometimes it could be a bluff, but you know what, to be able to sort of play around, like let's say Imperm Veiler with those traps that you can actually activate on the same turn, definitely pretty interesting, and curious how this deck is going to move forward. And then you have Yubel. It is definitely a big drop off in the scores after these first two decks, but you know what, they got the Spirit Gates to 3. They did get Phantom hit to 1, which is great, because that being essentially like a Link 0 monster negate, that was really strong. Yubel had fallen off quite a bit just before this, because since the release of Fualos, essentially because they get hit with Fualos and Perlea quite hard, your opponent is going to draw quite a lot. I one time resolved Fualos against Yubel, they went full for it, and I drew like 18 cards. So honestly, other than that, I think when uninterrupted, Yubel's end board is so incredibly strong, and definitely the best one out of all these decks. Then we have Kashtira Fiendsmith. I mean, I was looking at the deck list for these topping events, and when it comes to Kashtira Fiendsmith, really it's just like this much Kashtira, just Unicorn Fenrir, sometimes a Rise Heart, not always, sometimes Shangri-La, not always, and then it's just the Fiendsmith stuff, and it's just a bunch of hand traps, which you could argue maybe is just modern deck building, but there's really not too much going on from like a pure engine standpoint, but it is doing well, and you do have to respect it. Moving on to tier 2, we have Tenpai still alive, surprisingly. I mean, part of that you could relate it to, you know, when a deck gets first hit, I think a lot of times people want to really try to make it work, right, before they fully give up. This was only based on first weekend after all, and so for now, I mean, definitely Tenpai has topped a few events. Most of them were playing sort of the Kashtira stuff, I think, to make up for the cards that they lost. I also think, while there was at least one list that topped without playing like Fualos and, let's say, Perlea, I think those cards are needed more than ever now for Tenpai, just because you lost so many engine cards, and you really do need to dig and draw into those. And then we have Labrynth. So I actually recently posted a Labrynth profile as well with Fiendsmith engine that you can check out. So I think the deck is still, nothing has really changed too much. I mean, you still have D-Bear. D-Bear is very strong right now because of Ryzeal, and obviously Tenpai has fallen. Let's say other like Branded has fallen. I guess with like anything with Fiendsmith, you can technically call it fusion. Maybe not as impactful though as some of the other decks, like let's say with Ryzeal, but nonetheless, I think the deck, nothing has really changed. They haven't really lost much. Something like Impulse obviously is actually quite strong against Labrynth, although ironically Labrynth can play it themselves, but I think the play of Impulse probably has gone down a bit more than it had before crossover breakers, just because I don't think it's as good. So next we have Voiceless Voice. Now I did mention at the beginning of the video in terms of the tier score being a little bit more volatile this time around because it's only based on 1 weekend worth of events. Not to try to completely discredit Voiceless Voice or anything, but at the same time this was sort of in the rogue category for quite some time. At the same time, I did recently provide a deck profile with a Voice that did top a regional event. Thanks to Mateus for sending that profile. He played like the Fiendsmith version. He talks about sort of the synergy because the Fiendsmith stuff are light monsters, right? But there was at least one other list that did top that sort of played sort of the quote-unquote pure way with like the Deer Servant stuff, which seems to be popular lately for this deck. I mean, you know what? The deck is pretty fairly easy to play. You get like an Omni Negate and you get some other protection along with it, some summon negating whatever. And so I think it's worth picking up if you are kind of new to the game, as long as you're willing to spend it. So next we have Mermail. This deck is still pretty strong. Going first, it is super scary. Just the hand rips. Sure, you can do more charming stuff, but it doesn't really give you like a ton of draws though, and they could still play around a little bit and still hand rip you and set up some Omni Negates, and I think they're still fairly good with that, except when it comes to Shifter, of course, it's very strong against this deck. From my experience, Droll wasn't actually all that game ending against Mermail. Like most times it was not. I feel like with the Coelacanth route, like they can just play through it pretty easily, at least from my experience. But I think this deck is definitely something to respect for sure. So next we have Goblin Biker. Now to be seen whether this deck can also maintain its tier 2 status in the next coming few weeks, but at the same time, I guess in theory, when the best deck is an Xyz based deck like Ryzeal, Goblin Bikers can do a little bit better because they do detach from opponent's monsters as well. And back when this deck was just about to come around the corner, Pearly was a tier 1 deck, although unfortunately Pearly didn't end up staying a tier 1 deck by the time Goblin Bikers became sort of quote unquote relevant, at least at a rogue level. I actually recently featured a profile for this as well that you can check out. I mean, I think it's pretty interesting. They're kind of like a rank 3 spam deck, so you can play with Fiendsmith stuff. There's been one that that topped without playing it, and you know what? I think it's definitely more room to explore. Next, you have Fire King. So there were actually few tops, and I believe one still played the Snake Eye stuff. I'm not quite sure how it bridges anymore. I don't think it does, but the most of the other ones were just playing with a Kashtira engine. And honestly, I've had the chance to go against pure Fire King so far in this current format. I actually don't think it's that bad, but of course it's definitely not the same as what it was before when it was able to sort of bridge into like your Snake Eye stuff, which made it really strong. And then moving on to the next rogue tier, we do have Magical Musketeer Fiendsmith, and kind of similar to Kashtira Fiendsmith, I was looking at the deck list for this one, and really it's sort of that same concept where you just have a very small engine, just like the Fiendsmith stuff. You have some Magical Musket cards, and then the rest are just like hand traps, and you're not really making the most out of actual Magical Musket's gimmick, which is being able to play their traps from their hand, for example, if you control a Magical Musket monster. So you're not seeing any of that, unfortunately, in these lists, but at least it is still doing well. So next we have Mimigul, which is a pleasant surprise, and actually not only got one top, but two tops at least that are publicly known. And so one of them actually played with a Pearly engine. I don't even want to call it a Pearly engine though, because he was actually playing all of the Pearly cards at like the full ratios except for the field spell, and he was describing how you sort of want to get hand trapped on the Pearly part of things, and then you sort of rank into the Mimigul extra deck monsters because their Xyz are based on 2 level 1s, which kind of works out. And so I think I like the gimmick of this deck. I just felt that, of course, with Dominus Impulse locking people out of Earth, it just sort of kills this deck. But I guess, as we said earlier, maybe Impulse isn't seeing as much play, and so you were able to see Mimigul sort of thrive a little bit for now. And then you have Ritual Beast. So this deck just continues to top, even though everyone keeps saying how, you know, all the Mulch armies just sort of kill this deck, especially the new one that's coming out that's also going to be for Graveyard and Banish. Who knows if that's going to be the final coffin. This deck is definitely, I think, quite hard to pilot though, so it's not a deck I don't think I would recommend to sort of a new player. The combos take, quite frankly, I think even longer than Plant Link, and it's like 15 minutes, I feel like. So it's a lot of banishing. They can play Shifter. They also can play a lot of like different Floodgate monsters, like namely Arch Nemesis Protos, which is really strong. Sometimes they might even play Colossus as well. So overall, I think it's strong if you are able to pilot it well, but I think it's not the best deck perhaps in the current format. And then you also have Blackwing, which happened to get multiple tops. I unfortunately haven't been able to see a deck list on YGOProduct.com for this deck yet. I don't know if it's still sort of the same thing as it was a couple of years ago when Darkwing Blast came out with their new synchro, where they can just burn a lot of life points based on the monster effects that the opponent plays. So not sure if it's the same way. Definitely let me know if you do play it and how you actually feel about the deck in the current format. So next, speaking of 2022 format, we do have tier limits. I believe both of them that top were sort of more 60 card lists. You're just playing like the horror stuff. At least one of them, or maybe both of them were playing Fiendsmith engine as well. So you know what, just slap Fiendsmith on anything and you probably have a pretty competent deck. The deck, if it goes first, and assuming it can still manage to find its way to mill sort of successfully at least, it's still really strong and a very layered interruption. Where this deck can potentially struggle is that their non-engine space is typically known to be pretty low, so that makes it kind of hard to go second, but no, you know what, it's still hanging on. So next we have Sky Striker, and this is referring to the pure version, by the way, not Maliss Sky Striker. I made sure to check, at least when it came to Dueling Book data, to look for decks that played Ray, because the Maliss version, they're only playing just the spells, right? But nonetheless, I mean, to be honest with you, I've come across this on Dueling Book multiple times already as well. It's always been pretty popular online at the very least. It is a going second deck. You have a lot of power spells to play with nowadays in the current format, but you do have to be a good pilot to actually be able to, do well with this deck. But there's definitely potential to top at the regional level even now. So next we have Branded Despia. This is a deck that I'm personally running in the current format, and of course they did take a big hit in the ban list with Gimmick Puppet Nightmare being banned. You do have some replacements like, let's say, DDD Requiem or Ido. They are much easier to deal with than something like Puppet, especially with something like Eclipse being popular thanks to, let's say, a Ryzeal. So I do think though, as I've been playing this deck quite a bit now in this current format, I still think it can hold its own, but of course the deck can definitely fold to like a single hand trap, particularly Imperm, not just Ash. In a lot of hands, I think this deck is definitely notorious for its some clunky as hands sometimes, just because it doesn't play a lot of hand traps. If anything, most of the time they're not. So other decks, when they say they brick, it's because they just only have hand traps, and at least you have some plays to hopefully survive. Branded, it's just so crazy how you will have these hands of 5 cards and they just do absolutely nothing. So that's sort of the main weakness, I would say, with Branded. But if you can at least play it to somewhat level, it is definitely fun to play. So next we have Orcus, and this deck did technically have some YCS level success heading into this current format. It also topped the regional so far in this new format post ban list. So I would say usually it's like a 60 card list. They're playing horror stuff. Of course, something like, let's say, Grass. I would say though, in my brief experience playing against this deck now in the new format post ban list, you know, don't get me wrong, I love Orcus. I wish it will thrive, but at the same time, I think from my experience going against this deck, it still felt like their interruptions were a little bit 2019-esque. I think it could definitely be stronger. And of course, let's say with something like Shifter still in the mix, maybe not main deck because Maliss. At the same time, you also even have different Dimension Ground, which is a popular thrust target for going first. I think it can be a little bit difficult for Orcus. And then you have Plant Link as usual. It's also another typical 60 card list as the one that topped. I mean, I looked at the deck list. Doesn't seem like much has really changed in terms of engine. The non-engine, sure, maybe changes every now and then, but I still think it does sort of similar things. And you know, you have like essentially with like your field spell, you can like tribute your opponent's monsters. They also still play the Rose Whip in the side, which along with something like Therion can really lock your opponent out of spells and traps. You do have to pilot it well, but clearly can still keep getting regional and, of course, even higher level success. And finally, we have Drytron. This actually did get a regional top, and I think it is, as a rogue option, still something worth considering, because with Ben 10, they can actually search Lancia, which against at least pure version of Maliss is very strong, right? And this sort of the Lancia interaction was something that was actually relevant back when Drytron was tier 1, because you know what, it's hard to believe, but at one point Lancia was actually a must-play side deck card back around, I want to say 2020, especially when Dinos were tier 1. But you know what, Drytron, Droll is pretty popular though, because it's also very good against, for example, let's say Ryzeal. It's for the most part usually decent against Yubel, depending on how they start their plays. So I think that does affect Drytron, not as much as it used to though. There's still going to be lines. They got Eva back, for example. The Herald of Orange Light line of play seems to have returned from at least my experience going against this deck. So I think if you know how to play it, it's definitely a pretty scary option, at least going first. Alright guys, so that was it for the meta tier list by the data for this month. Hopefully you found that interesting. Definitely really looking forward to as this format develops, especially with Supreme Darkness just around the corner as well. But anyways, big thanks to all of you for watching. Huge thanks to my patrons and sponsors for the continued support, and well, take care guys.